Well, listeners, one of the highlights at this year's Monster Fest is the brand new film from Stephen Kostanski. It is called Frankie Freako, and we know that you are going to love this film, so we thought we would get Stephen on the phone right now to chat a little bit about it. Welcome to the program, mate.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, mate, we haven't got very long with you today, so we thank you so much for your time. So we'll keep it tight, but first of all, tell us a little bit about where this journey started for you with this film.
I mean, I had a bit of time in my schedule. I was prepping to do Death Stalker, and that got pushed, so I had like this gap where I decided to squeeze in a smaller movie, literally and figuratively, where I had an idea of doing like a little jerk monster movie, like a Ghoulies or Gremlins. Prior to shooting this, I'd been streaming a lot of little monster movies with my DOP, Pierce Dirks, and we basically watched every single cruddy little monster movie that there is, and that sort of furthered my obsession with this subgenre. And I felt like it was kind of underrepresented in the horror community. And that was coupled with the fact that, I've always worked with Connor Sweeney and always had him in my films, like, he's part of Astron 6. We've always worked together, but I feel like he's never really had something that showcases his comedic talents to the full extent. And we were shooting a merchandise commercial for Psycho Goreman, where it was just him riffing and playing to camera. And, it was when we were shooting that I felt like I want to build a whole movie around this guy, and specifically make a movie that's just 82 minutes of him getting his ass kicked by little puppets.
So, the actual character of Frankie, you said you wanted to create a little monster. How did you take that next step then to what your little monster would look like?
We went through a pretty extensive design process with him. He went through multiple iterations, different looks and things. We knew that we wanted him to be like a little rock and roll party dude, and it was just kind of like, well, how do we realize that in an iconic way? One of the starting points for me was just figuring out what the colors of each of the characters would be. I figure giving each Freako a distinct color would help them stand out and make them unique. So I went with RGB for the main three, so red, green, and blue. Frankie red, Boink green, and Dottie blue. And so each character, we just kind of riffed on what their deal was, what their backstory was, treating them like they were their own unique entity that could potentially have their own movie. It was similar logic to like Full Moon movies, specifically the Puppet Master films, where you feel like every puppet in that franchise has its own story and feels disconnected from the other puppets in an interesting way. Like it's a fun ensemble, as opposed to just a bunch of similar things. So we wanted to emulate that as much as possible.
Definitely. There are a lot of filmmakers out there these days that will either just make a standard drama, or they will go all out and do a big action film with CGI and things like that. Tell us a little bit about working with puppets. How does that change how you go about making the film, but also what's that process of creating the puppets? How long does it take? And just in general, how does it change the filmmaking process?
We really underestimated how time-consuming and elaborate puppet work was going to be. I literally had the dumb logic of like, well, they're like a third the size of people, so it's going to be a third the amount of problems compared to something like PG, where I've got people in full creature suits. And so, that ended up being completely wrong. Puppetry is a very complex art. There's a reason why it's so expensive and why good puppeteers are in high demand, because it is a very complicated and precise process. And I kind of just threw everybody into it. Like all of us were like, let's make a puppet movie without thinking twice about it. And it was definitely a steep learning curve in terms of how we executed the puppets. It was a combination of a bunch of different things. There was a little bit of animatronics, simple cable mechanisms, rod puppetry, hand puppets, and there's even some like stop motion in the film as well. So I tried to use every old school technique possible to execute this. Definitely learned a lot. A lot went wrong with the puppets, like they're very finicky things, and so it was a real learning experience. But I feel better about it now. I feel like the next one will really nail it. now that we've kind of hit all the potholes
Yeah.
that you can making a puppet movie.
Having things like stop motion and that in there as well, it adds something very special to the film. Was that something that you wanted to do from the very start when you started working on Frankie Freako?
I didn't really have like a specific idea on how I wanted to execute like the minecart chase in the film. Initially it was just going to be miniatures, but then I realized like just the scale of it and the travel of the minecarts didn't feel real, so I switched to stop motion. And yeah, a bit of a learning curve there, but I am more experienced in stop motion, so it was really just a natural progression of my skill set already, and ended up being one of the most fun parts of making the movie. Animating that entire sequence and building all the little miniatures for it was a lot of fun, and it was very contained, and I had full control over everything. It was really going back to my early days of filmmaking when I'd do stop motion in my parents' basement, and it was just a simpler time.
Yeah.
And it was nice to revisit that.
You mentioned about wanting to work with Connor Sweeney on this film, and that he was always going to play Connor in this. Tell us a little bit about what he was like to work with, and how did he feel about being able to have that opportunity to bring his comedy to this film as well?
I mean, I think he was right on board until he realized he had to act against a bunch of inanimate objects, which is something that he was justifiably frustrated with. I mean, he has to carry the movie because he's the central character and he's the central human character. So there's so many scenes where he's just performing against inanimate objects and having to do all the labor, and doing extra work just to compensate for the fact that, the puppets aren't as animated as he is. So I know that it was an exhausting process for him, but when we were jamming on set and coming up with ideas, it was the most fun ever. Like, we really had a great time shooting this movie. Lots of laughs.
Definitely. Now, Stephen, I know we haven't got you for much longer, so I'll wrap it up. But how do you feel about Frankie Freako being screened at Monster Fest, Australia's largest cult cinema festival? How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel like Astron 6 has a history with Monster Fest. I think we've had a few of our movies play there, so I'm happy to continue that tradition. I hope I get to make it down there at some point. I've never been down that way, so I would really like to do it someday, and I hope the crowd appreciates Frankie Freako. It's a very strange movie. It definitely... You have to be on a very specific wavelength, I think, to get the full joy of it. I think it'll delight some and infuriate others, but I feel like the Monster Fest crowd is the kind of crowd that would be delighted by this sort of thing. So I'm looking forward to hearing how the reaction is. Definitely.
We would love to have you down here one day. And last question, what would you like to say to people who are heading out to Monster Fest this weekend to watch Frankie Freako?
Fasten your freak belts for a wild time with the ultimate party animal.